follower of Aleister Crowley, the infamous magician who created his own cult, his own religion. Parsons himself, at the same time he's working on rockets for the U.S. military, he's also conducting rituals in the desert trying to summon angels and demons. I'm not making this stuff up, in case you're wondering. One of his co-workers, one of his partners in his ritual working, his ritual magic, was L. Ron Hubbard, the man who later went on to found Scientology. Hubbard stole Jack Parsons' money, stole Jack Parsons' girlfriend, ran to Miami and bought a boat. In later years, Hubbard would speak very fondly of Aleister Crowley, claiming he had met him. He never did. Crowley died in 1947, before Hubbard had even actually heard of him. But Parsons was investigated by the FBI as a security risk because he was involved in occult workings. But at the same time, Parsons is a brilliant scientist. Well, just as he's getting ready to leave the United States through all the pressure of the FBI investigations, there's a mysterious explosion at his home. He dies under very mysterious circumstances. The house literally blows up with him in it. Theodor von Karman was the leader of the group that founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He has a crater on the moon named after him. Born in Hungary, studied in Germany. He was a brilliant rocket scientist as well. And he formed the Jet Propulsion Laboratory with a couple of other people, Frank Molina and, of course, Parsons, Ed Foreman, and a Chinese scientist, another brilliant man called Qian Suisun. Qian Suisun goes on to later fame in another area of rocket science and space science. So von Karman was a guy, shown here, by the way, with a Nazi scientist down here. This is Qian up here, and this is von Karman. This scientist, von Karman had known before in Germany and was instrumental in getting him to come to the United States to work on the space program with him. Qian was the man they sent to debrief Wernher von Braun. Wernher von Braun, of course, was the Nazi scientist that was brought to the United States under something called paperclip. Wernher von Braun we'll get into in more detail just in a few minutes. But Qian was also investigated by the FBI. Everybody involved in the rocket program in the United States in the 1930s and 1940s wound up being investigated by the FBI for one reason or another. He eventually got so sick and tired he defected to China after all of the harassment he had been undergoing by the FBI. And what happened? He develops China's space program. He creates the Silkworm missile that was used to such effect during the first Iraq invasion. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and all of that, he was sending Scud missiles and all of this. The Silkworms were in use there in the Middle East. So Qian, starting as a patriotic American citizen helping with the space program, through all the suppression by FBI, all the harassment, gives up, basically, goes back to China, and becomes a hero in China, develops, jump-starts the Chinese space program. When we're talking today about the space race and the space programs, as we'll be getting into with the other speakers, keep in mind the fact that it began in two important places. It began in Germany with the rocket systems and the rocket development in Germany at Peenemünde, Nordhausen, which we'll get into in a second. But it also started in the United States. And the reason that China is launching rockets today and launching satellites is because of this man, who could have been part of our space program for the rest of his life, and instead, because of all sorts of political nonsense, wound up going to China and giving them a space program almost complete. At the same time in Germany, in the same year, almost the same month, 1936, we have Fritz Goslau of the Argus company. He begins work on remote-controlled aircraft. And a few years later, December of 1942, we have the first launch, successful launch of the V-1. If you've been following History Channel stuff about World War II and the Blitz and all of that, you'll know about the V-1s and the devastating effect that they had. This is a picture of the V-1 at the time, and this is another one. Later termed the world's first cruise missile. These were launched from aircraft. The V-1 would drop from a plane and then go on its way. Aimed at London, of course, and later, as we know, at Antwerp. Devastating weapon, resulting in almost 23,000 civilian deaths at the time. But at the same time, back in 1941, we have the first jet-assisted takeoff launch in California by the von Karman group. Jack Parsons is here. We have Jack Parsons right here watching the takeoff of the first jet-assisted takeoff plane, a jet-powered plane. So here we have the rocket scientist who's also an occultist and a follower of Aleister Crowley and a member of all kinds of other occult organizations involved in these important events of the rocket program. In 1944, of course, we have the V-2. The Germans launched the V-2. Actually, more people were killed making the V-2 than were killed by the V-2 because of slave labor in Germany and because of the concentration camp labor that was brought to Nordhausen and later to Mittelbau-Dora concentration camps and the factories attached to Buchenwald. More people were actually killed making these V-2s than were actually killed in suffering under them. So the Nazi rocket program, as we know it, started at Peenemünde, was later relocated, and the person in charge of this was General Walter Dornberger, and his assistant was Wernher von Braun. We'll get back to them in a second. Another important personality in aviation medicine this time was Dr. Hubertus Strughold. He's a man in charge of all sorts of horrendous experiments on living persons in the camps, and yet is considered the father of aviation medicine. He was brought to the United States. He was given his own institute at Randolph Air Force Base in Texas, and they had a building named after him until the local Daughters of the American Revolution decided that having a building named after this guy was probably not the best message to send to our next generations of young people studying medicine, so they took the name off. People were aware that Strughold was basically a monster. We've all heard of Operation Paperclip, I think. Started as Operation Crossbow, Operation Overcast. The British were trying to get the scientists. Russians were trying to get Nazi scientists. And the Americans had their own program, which they then later renamed as Paperclip. It wasn't just the men, the scientists they were bringing over. It was also their documentation. It was also as much machinery as they could possibly get. We are talking about hundreds of railroad cars, freight cars filled with documents and equipment and machinery. Not talking even about the hundreds at first, and then thousands of Nazi scientists that were brought to the United States. Here's a photograph of the team at Fort Bliss, Texas, Paperclip members. That's a hell of a lot of Nazi scientists. And not a single funny hat among them, I will point out. One thing it's important to remember about the space program in the United States, until 1957, it was not a civilian program. For the first 10 years, or 15 years of its existence, it was a military program. There was no NASA. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration had not been created yet. So all of these people worked for the military. The rocket program was a military program. And you have to remember that's the origins of the space program, was with the Army, which later became the Army Air Force, which later became NASA. I mean, the space program went under NASA. These were supposed to be our Nazis, right? We were sold a bill of goods. I mean, the United States was told us, oh, these people are not really Nazis. They were Germans. They were scientists. They were helping out. They were working for us. They really weren't believers. Yeah, right. Why then, if this is so, did we bring the best and the brightest to the United States, give them whatever they wanted, all the resources that they wanted, whatever they needed, whatever they asked for? And the Soviet Union was the first country to launch a satellite into space. If they were really working for the United States and they had become born-again American patriots and card-carrying Republicans, yes, Republicans, how did it happen that we didn't get a rocket into space, we didn't get a satellite into space, that the Russians were the first? Well, what happened? Weren't they sabotaging our space program since the very beginning? These are the true believers. This is just a handful of the people you'll come across when you research this. Walter Dornberger later becomes the head of NASA. Later gets a board position with Bell Aerospace in the United States. Is considered a rabid Nazi by military intelligence officials who are doing background checks in Germany. They've got witness statements, they've got documents, they've got everything they need to put Dornberger in jail for the rest of his life. Those documents are buried. Wernher von Braun was an SS major. There are photographs of Wernher von Braun in an SS uniform. The SS was not the Rotary. It was not the Boy Scouts. You didn't just, kind of join the SS because it would further your career. No, that didn't work that way. In order to join the SS, you had to prove your racial purity going back to the year 1750. There had to be no Untermenschen in your background, right? No Jews, no Gypsies, no Slavs, no Democrats. Nobody like that in the background of your racial purity. You had to prove this, and you had to maintain a certain degree of involvement with the SS all the time. The SS was a pagan cult. The SS forbade mention of Christian holidays even in their documentation. The SS was extremely pagan, was extremely anti-Christian, anti-Jewish, anti-everything else. If you had a rank of major in the SS, you did not get that automatically. You got that because you proved yourself. And Wernher von Braun was proven later to have been involved in meetings discussing slave labor requirements for the rocket systems at Peenemünde and also at Mittelbau. He was involved in these discussions. He knew about the killings of prisoners, the torture of prisoners. He was involved in all of that. It didn't matter to Wernher von Braun. At the same time that he's working for us, we bring him over under paperclip. He's now in the United States. What is he doing? He's sending classified materials out of the country to his comrades back in Germany. We know this. It's part of the documentation. It's part of the record now. These files have been declassified. Wernher von Braun was working against the United States almost from the beginning. This is a scandal, But yet we consider him the father of the American space program. I mean, he's the one who got us to the moon, right? Kurt Debus was the first director of the Kennedy Space Center, the first director of the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral in Florida. He was a member of the SS and the SA, the Sturmabteilung, right, the brown shirts, the stormtroopers, two other Nazi organizations. This is the man who turned in his friends and co-workers to the Gestapo if they made disloyal remarks. This was a true believer, once again. As I say, he was an SS officer. The Allies considered the SS a criminal organization for very good reason. And yet, we put this guy in charge of the Kennedy Space Center. Theodor Zobel, another scientist, performed experiments on prisoners in the wind tunnel experiments. We brought him over. He worked for us. Hubertus Struckel, as I mentioned, tortured prisoners, killed people just for experiments, dumped them into freezing cold water to see how long they would survive. Stuff like that. Jumpstarts the Aviation Medicine Institute at Randolph Air Force Base. George Rickey, very famous Nazi, murdered prisoners personally murdered them at the Mittelbau-Dora site. Right, is given positions with American corporations in the United States. Emil Salmon worked as an engineer at Wright-Patterson, as you can see. He torched a synagogue. Heinz Gesicke, rocket engineer. His family in the United States during the war was spying for the Nazis. He was fine. He was okay. Denazified. Otto Ambros. We've all heard of Otto Ambros, probably. Executive at IG Farben. This is the guy involved in administering the experiments in Zyklon B, the gas that was used in the death camps. He gets a job with W.R. Grace and Company. Leonard Alberts gets a job with the Bechtel Corporation. All big American corporations, all very important members of the military-industrial complex. His co-workers hated him, that he was just too Nazi even for them, and some of them were Nazis. Didn't hurt him at all. They moved him from position to position, but they kept him on. In May 29, 1947, to give you an idea of how badly the Nazi paperclip scientists were sabotaging the American space program, the United States attacked Mexico with a missile. A missile, this one, the Hermes missile, based on the V-2 design, was launched by German scientists at White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. It went up, and then it took a right. And it wound up in Juarez, Mexico, just outside of a heavy populated area. Hit the ground, blew a crater 50 meters across. We actually bombed Mexico with a missile in 1947. The Mexican government was not amused. It's like, we have people going across the border this way, you're sending missiles this way, what's up? Well, the Germans in charge of this had sabotaged the guidance system. so that it wouldn't go where it was supposed to go. And the American engineers who were responsible for some of these experiments were complaining like